Hi everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this lunchtime. My name is Sean O'Leary. I'm Senior Planner with the Planning Institute, and because I published a history of Irish planning in 2014, I'm really glad that we're getting to talk about planning history today. I'm joined by a really eminent panel of guests to talk about the 1963 Act. We've got founding member of the Institute and past president Enda Conway. We've past presidents Kieran Tracy and Philip Jones. We've Paula Russell from UCD. And I'll introduce our speakers in a second before we hear from them. And then we're planning on taking any questions through the Q&A function for 10 or 15 minutes at the end, just before we close at 2 o'clock. Just to briefly remind you of why we're here and why we're doing it today is the Local Government Planning and Development Act 1963 wasn't the first Irish Planning Act. There was a Planning Act in 1934 as amended in 1939, but we can talk about that some other day. There had been plans for a planning bill in 1960, but the Minister for Local Government, Neil Blaney at the time, was very frustrated that the Attorney General thought that drafting a planning bill could take up to 3 months. And I'm really not sure what he would say about legislative drafting today. So he was told it would take 3 months to draft a planning bill in 1960, and we ended up not getting a planning bill until the Local Government Planning and Development Bill, which became the Act we know, was introduced to the Dáil on the 12th of July 1962. The second stage commenced in November 1962, and then it cleared both houses of the Oireachtas on this day, the 31st of July 1963. Then it was signed into law by President De Valera in the 7th of August 63, and as we know, it came to have effect from the 1st of October 1964. The 63 Act obliged 87 local authorities to act as planning authorities and to prepare a development plan for their area on or before October 1967. And Michael Bannon, who is somebody that we will be talking about, I'm sure, said at the time that for a country with a lack of planning tradition or adequate technical staff, this was a daunting task. And that capacity issue is something that I'm sure we'll be talking about over the next hour as well. And then something else I'm sure we'll talk about is that despite UN reports and UN support in the 1960s on urban renewal and planning, the new planning system was very similar to the post-war British system under the Town and Country Planning Act. Some newspapers, the Irish Times at the time, thought that this was a good thing because the UK were pioneers who make the worst mistakes and latecomers like us can learn from them. There was a lot of critics of the 63 legislation who thought that it was imitating planning acts in Britain, despite there being very little parallel between the two countries. And then just to I suppose set the scene, 1960s Dublin, we still had tenements, there was still tenement collapses, but this planning system was seen as being essential to economic growth and prosperity, and I suppose those aims are something that I think we'll talk about in the next hour as well. And then one final thing just to note is there was a very prescient report by Inferris Forbaha in 1983 on 20 years of the system, where Bernard Grist categorized the 63 Act as being legislature-led with little reference to public attitudes and with public opinion courted only after its enactment. And I think there still might be lessons today for what that means for planning reform legislation as well. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to get through in terms of format. I'm going to ask Enda, Kieran, Philip and Paula in turn some questions to kick it off, and we'll see how the conversation goes. And then we have time for your questions at the very end. I suppose in terms of introductions, I'll just introduce the guests we have first. First is Enda Conway, who was a founding member and second president of the Irish Planning Institute. And you'll have seen in a recent newsletter that Enda has very kindly donated much of his archive to the Institute and the care of our new Archives Committee. And Enda is going to talk mainly about his experience as a professional planner in the early years of the Act and I suppose the role of the planner at the time. Kieran Tracy has been involved with the Institute since its launch in 1975. He was elected a fellow in 2008 and was president in 1996, 1997. He worked as an inspector in the Spatial Planning Unit of the Department of Environment in Waterford County, Dún Laoghaire Borough, Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, and latterly Leitrim. And he was elected an honorary member of the Institute in 2022. Philip Jones has been a corporate member of the Institute since 1983, and he served first on the Institute's Council in 1986. He was president from 1999 to 2001, which again was another legislatively significant time period. And he was elected a fellow in 2008, and he's worked in Waterford, Kildare, and latterly he works in Bord Pleanála, and he's also an honorary member of the Institute. And then finally, Dr. Paula Russell graduated from the MRUP in UCD in 1993 and completed her PhD in regional and urban planning in 2002. And she's head of subject for regional and urban planning at the UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. And she's also served on our Technical and Education Committee. And Paula is going to reflect on planning education in the context of UCD's role then and planning education now into the future. So that's who we're going to hear from this lunchtime. And I suppose, first of all, Enda, it's really, I just wanted to ask you to describe your training and when you came out into planning, which was, I think, just after the 63 Act had commenced.
Yes, thank you. Well, I started off in engineering, civil engineering, and I spent several years there and worked on in Northern Ireland and in London, and I specialised a lot in traffic engineering as such. So I joined Dublin County Council Planning Department in 1966, and when I joined, the Planning Act was up and going then, and generally speaking, the reaction of the public was very good. It was a good realisation that we needed some planning and we needed to look ahead and to plan things. And there was a growing concern for the environment. And it was encouraging to that extent. From the political point of view, there was a mixed reaction, really. A lot of politicians felt that it might hinder their control of things. And you'll notice how the Section 4 of the 63 Act brought in just for that purpose. And it became, as we remember, very controversial indeed after that. So, excuse me. Now, the administration of the Act was very slow and tedious, and it really only the minimum happened, whatever was necessary. For example, it was confined simply to development control and appeals. I mean, all the environmental implications of the Act were ignored. Even the development plans were sort of put on the long finger in many cases. So I got involved at the time in Dublin City and County, we joined together, trying to get some improvement on the situation there from staff and qualifications and all that. And it was very difficult. So in reality, in the planning authorities, the county engineer became the de facto planning officer. And in each county, an engineering assistant was designated to be the planning officer. And in reality was left to do the job on their own, but not much so. And they're very isolated people. So the minister, I should say, was involved in dealing with the planning appeals. And though he had a function in the coordination of development plans, that just wasn't happening at all. But the appeal system suddenly got into difficulties because after a very short period, there was a huge delay in the issuing and the dealing with planning appeals. In fact, it was about 2 years gap in many cases. And that led to all sorts of shenanigans and strange goings on. So even the politicians themselves were delighted when the power went to the Manola, because it was quite unpopular. So in 1970, I set up API. I could see that there was a need for
And API, and it was the Association of
Physical Planners, yes. Association of Physical Planners of Ireland, who put the Ireland into. So, and there was a huge response to my initial invitation. Virtually every planner in the country came on board, and it was set up in 1970. And I managed to get involved in the Engineers Working Party agreement, which was dealing with the qualifications, and managed to get involved in planning, chief planning assistant and planning assistant as a separate grade, which was throughout the country. So that was quite an achievement in that sense. And immediately then all these posts were filled. So we suddenly had a chief planning assistant, chief engineering assistant as a chief planning assistant in each county. So I became secretary of the association. Sean Lucy was chairman of it. And then as things moved on and the impetus started to come from the school of UCD for the new institute, we went with them and joined them and helped to create the institute. And that was set up in 1975 with great celebration internally. So in the meantime, the first senior planner post was created. It was created in Dublin City. First application, there was only one applicant. The only qualification was membership of the RTPI, and that applicant wasn't eligible, so that should be took on. So I did a lot of correspondence with UCD and with the minister, and wasn't getting very far because all of the staff in the department were members of RTPI and were opposed to the institute as such. So I was able to get personally to the minister and persuade, get things moving, and eventually the UCD qualification was accepted for that post.
And just how many planners, how many members of API were there in the early 70s? Like what number of planners do you think were in the country?
We had about a membership of about 90, I think it was, which was actually everybody other than us. There was one, every county was represented. So it was quite successful in that sense. So then the institute started to act, and we got very involved in establishing our status in the community, in the sense that we organized conferences, lectures, workshops. We published panels. We had a circular, an annual circular circulated. We established a rural forum. We created the Cork branch. And we also got involved in the European Council of Town Planners. Our past president, Joan Caffrey, got involved in that and very quickly became president of the ECGP and did a great lot of work in promoting that throughout Europe, and spent quite some time in Europe doing that too. So that was quite a success. We also got involved immediately with the School of Planning in UCD and in Queen's, and coordinated and gave prizes for presentations and such. So one of the big efforts we made was to successfully got ourselves involved in the 1991 Compensation Act. We set up a conference and got all the main people involved in it and made a submission to the minister. And virtually all our draft was accepted into the legislation. So that was a successful situation for us. I should mention too that in those days, we had Forest Fur was operational and was very effective in planning. Jerry Walker, one of our presidents, was the chief planner there, and Barry Muckley, who was our first secretary, did a paper. One of the papers he did was on the one-off housing, the countryside. Unfortunately, that wasn't published because it was felt that it wouldn't be very popular with the boys. So that was never published. So the other thing I feel I must recall, and historically speaking, is that I was amazed by all the opposition we had got in the early stages. We got opposition strongly from engineers, for example, but particularly from the southern branch of the RTPI, who strongly opposed everything we did. And even the submission of the southern branch on the education of planners, which was run by the Forest Fur, but they just said there shouldn't be any school of planning in UCD, no need for one in Ireland. So I had a lot of personal confrontations those days on these things. And I just think it should be recorded historically that there was a strong opposition. I just want to say that at one point, it was confirmation for me that was contrary to RTPI policy. I met Joe Gordon Cherry, who was here in Dublin to meet the minister, and he came to me and asked my advice. What should he say to the minister? Because he has been pressurized by the Dublin people to try to curtail the activities of the Irish Planning Institute and to ask the minister to take some action. So I want to record that as a historic event.
Thanks, and I think we'll pick up on a lot of those things. Next we'll go to Kieran. And I suppose the first question, Kieran, really was just your experience of where you studied and then coming out into planning. Kind of the act is probably about 10 years old, maybe.
What happened? Well, believe it or not, because I was always interested in doing town planning, and there was no undergraduate planning course. So I looked at my options and actually went into social science because it was the quickest way to get into the postgrad course. And there were fewer social scientists looking for places, so it was easier to get a place. And I was very fortunate in 74 to get a place there. And I suppose like at that stage, the school wasn't very old, as you've already heard, and we had our core staff, and Brendan Murphy was my tutor, great man, passed away in an untimely way. But Kevin I. Nolan was actually the head of the department, and we mentioned that the 63 Act is basically a copy of the earlier UK Act, and in fact, Kevin I. was actually the draftsman for the 63 Act, and he was quite proud of the fact that he put in a very innovative element into it, which wasn't in the British Act, and that was what we now call the 8-week default. And of course, he couldn't see down the line to see the problems that this would cause in future years. But I thought it was interesting how he saw that. What was also interesting about the time was, unlike any of the other subjects, planning law was done over the 2 years, but it was only examined in the final year, which I thought was very, very difficult. And I honestly believe, because of that, and also because we were dealing with the Planning Act as theoretical rather than practical, I could never get my head around it. And I was actually quite chuffed to be one of a few that actually passed that subject in the second year. And I got a bit of a benediction, I have to admit, from Kevin I. Normally they say, 40, 45, 45 to 50 with how you got your score. I got 40, not 40, 45, not 41, 40. In other words, I'm letting you through. And it was only when I actually went out into the workplace and started implementing the Act that I could actually get my head around the Act. And, there was obviously the administrative side of it, and you were implementing the planning and everything else like that. But what we were implementing to a degree, like compared to today, was very, very simple. Now, my first job was as a temporary member of the planning department in Dunleary Borough. And because of the kind of structures that Ben has just been talking about, I wasn't employed as a planner. I was actually employed as a second-year student graduate engineer because I'd done 2 years in an engineering school. So even though I had my qualification, I was classed as a second-year student engineer for the purposes of salary and everything else. So when I actually got a permanent job, I got a hike through the roof in terms of salary. I couldn't believe myself. But working at that, the documentation that we dealt with was very, very simple. And again, going back to what Enda was talking about, some of the local authorities actually adopted the earlier plans, and actually Dunleary Borough was one of those. And the chief assistant borough engineer who was assigned to planning was actually Seamus Gibbons, and Seamus had worked in the UK. And I can honestly swear that if I took up the development plan for the Port of Grimsby, which is where Seamus had worked, and I took up the first plan for Dunleary Borough and put them side by side, you could hardly tell the difference other than the word Grimsby was struck out and Dunleary was put in. Now, that had actually changed by the time I arrived in 76 back into Dunleary, and because I'd been there as a student in my inter first and second year. But they had actually done a new development plan in 1973, I think it was. And that was actually highly influenced by Antashka, so that it actually had more listed buildings in the Dunleary Borough plan than were listed buildings in every plan in the rest of the country. There were literally hundreds of buildings, and that had its own problems. But at least the community in Dunleary had engaged in the making of that plan, and that was actually a very good plan for its time. But in 2014, I would jump very far forward. I retired from a senior planner in Leitrim County Council, and I knew I would be expected to say something about progress in planning and all of that. So I actually took out the 1963 planning bill. I still have a copy of it. I got the 1977 regulations when it just come in when I started working in Dunleary full time, and I took out the Dunleary plan. No, not the 1968 one, the 1973 one. And I said, these are the documents that I had to work with every day when I started working. And then I took out the 2000 Act, 2001 regulations, which are significantly bigger than the other legislation. I took out our county development plan, the SCA, the retail strategy. We had the local area plan for Carrick-on-Shannon. We had framework plans for Manor Hamilton, Ballinamore, Drumshanbo, Bogle, Drumahair, all executed separately. And I said, that's the pile of documents that I now have to deal with today on a day-to-day basis. And that kind of illustrated the way we actually have developed since 1963. And I think we have to be quite proud of being able to do that. The codification of the legislation in 2000 was a big job and had a big impact. And Una Buckley would have been the barrister in the department at the time who was doing the 2000 Act. And it was a significant interest, but it also highlights some of the complexities that we have to deal with when we are codifying and renewing and reforming the development plan. For example, one of my favorite things, and Philip here earlier was talking about, nobody's doing enforcement. We did a lot of enforcement in Dunleary when I was there in the old borough. And our borough law agent believed in going to the High Court because you got a better solution and we got the better fees. And we had more High Court cases than nearly anybody else in the country because of this. But one of the sections that was in the old Act was a section called 31(1)(b). And 31(1)(b), because if you remember when the 63 Act was written, the life of the permission had no expiry date. So the section 31(1)(b) was there to allow a planning authority to turn around and say, lads, you've had enough time to finish this development. The people are still living with muck and brick and everything around them. We're going to tell you you have till such and such a date to finish off your estate. And if they didn't finish off the estate by that date, we would then go and we'd put an enforcement notice on, and then we get them to finish the estate under the enforcement notice or bring them to court if they didn't. But when they brought in the new legislation, they brought in the determination of permissions and even the extension of permissions when they're not completed. But they never dealt with the legacy of all the old permissions that had no expiry date on them. And they did away with section 31(1)(b). So we ended up with this major lacuna in trying to get around that. So those are the kind of the lessons that I would have brought from that experience of going through all those different aspects. We had an interesting time, in terms of the education, but it was, I often tell this to people. When I did my social science degree, there was 100 girls in a year, and there was 10 fellas. And by coincidence, something similar was 100 male engineers and 10 female engineers. So they actually put those 2 years together for their graduation. So when I'm sitting there collecting my BSOC SC, and the professor of engineers up there, and he's saying to the engineers, he says to them, "You lads down there, you all think you're engineers, don't you? You've got your degree. I'm about to give you the piece of paper. But I have news for you. You're not engineers. You're not qualified engineers. You're qualified to become engineers. In other words, you now have the nuts and bolts and the tools to go out and learn the trade." And that's what happened in UCD. We got the nuts and bolts to go out and learn the trade. And I was very fortunate that one of my first, after I was a year in Dunleary Borough on temporary, before I got a permanent job. But I got a permanent job down in Waterford with Jim Shine, who would have been an NAPI member and a founding. We had the grandfather clause for getting into the IPI in the old days, if you were there working long. And Jim was a great man for going back to first principles and learning on the job. And that's where I think you learn your legislation by using it. You learn the job by doing it. And the qualifications you get prepare you, hopefully, to do that. And I think that was one of the great strengths of UCD and our profession. We all learn, and we do have that mentoring, and we have that relationship with our superiors, etc.
Thanks, Kieran. There's stuff there that I'm sure we'll pick up on again. So Philip, same question as Kieran. Where did you study and your early career, again, when the Act, I suppose, had been embedded in by that stage, and what it was like starting to work under the 63 Act?
As you know, Kieran is a little bit older than I am. So I came out.
Look at me.
I came out from Trinity with an arts degree, including geography, in '77, and went and did the very, very competitive interview, I have to say, to get into the, as it was then, the diploma in town planning in UCD. At the time, we used to, those of us who went to Trinity, and some people here will recall this, we used to call Belfield Polytech, but in fact it wasn't. We were in one of the last students in Earthford Terrace. And what got me interested was one of the courses we did in geography was done by Fred Allen, Professor Fred Allen, and one of the other lecturers there, I don't know if anybody remembers him, was James Killen. And James Killen in Trinity was obsessed I think it's fair to say, with the Dublin Transport Initiative and trying to get rid of the idea of having elevated motorways over Dublin and try and do something to make it more European rather than American. And actually that got me interested in planning. So that's why I went on to go and do in UCD. And one of the key things in UCD that I found absolutely marvelous was when I was in Trinity, you sat there and you participated in lectures. When you went to UCD, you were there full time, 9 to 5, and a lot longer than that. But most afternoons you had what was called studio. In other words, you were working there with maps, which as a geographer I didn't have a problem with, but also drawings, repeatograph pens, the whole thing. And one of the other great things they did in UCD was they brought in professionals at the end of each bit of the studio work when they had a crit. I recall one time we got a whole pile of lectures and a whole pile of demonstrations on how to do housing scheme layout. And this was all the time with the Cheshire layout and the Essex design guide and so on. And we all worked away, and I think there was something like 15 in our class that year. And we all worked away and did what we thought was exactly what you were supposed to do. And then they brought in a couple of people from the school, but also they had an architect planner in private practice, who subsequently became the president of this institute, Fergus McCabe. And he listened to us all during our earnest arguments about this is exactly what people want, and we've enough space for good gardens and all the rest of it. That's all right, very well, lads, and now you'll get lots of marks. But really, he pulled out a set of drawings that this is what will sell. None of that stuff there is any good because no builder will build it because you haven't got high enough density. And now you're going to call your service are going to cost a fortune, and you put in too much open space. This will never sell. And right through the 2 years, we had this kind of thing, the reality check. We had all this stuff about what we should do. And then we had the reality check. In reality, this isn't going to work. So as Kieran said, you learned on the job, but I think very much UCD gave you an idea that it wasn't just theoretical. There was a real world out there. And I suspect some people, when they came out of the course, didn't get as much of a shock about the real world as perhaps they might have in earlier years when they just got theoretical stuff in planning. So I think that was very good in UCD. I was lucky enough to be in the first coterie people. They were busy working away, Kevin Nolan and Michael Bannon in particular, to try and get made into a master's course. So I was actually one of a group who were the first people to actually have the same course. I went in as a diploma in town planning, but I came out with the master's in regional and urban planning. And I remember Michael Bannon telling me afterwards when I queried him, why is it called MRUP, not, you put the regional first and the urban second? He said, well, I have an ambition in the future that we'll have bachelor's degree, and I don't want people coming out with names with letters after the names BURP. So that is why it has been called ever since Masters in Regional and Urban Planning, for that reason. Now, as it happened, it took many years to get more than just the MRUP. So I started off in 1980. And as Enda said, there was a lot of negotiations going on. In 1979, there was a thing called the Engineers Working Party Agreement. And the unions were negotiating with the County Managers Association, as it was then, with the department behind the Managers Association. And the big row was about qualifications for jobs. The whole idea, as Enda said, was you had a planning assistant and then a chief planning assistant, but they were quote unquote engineering grades. And the intention was there would be a proper list of and levels for planners. And they couldn't get agreement between the unions, and the unions were represented by what was known as the Local Government Professional Services Union, or Local Government LGPSU, now that's FORSA, and the ITGWU, which is now SIPTU. And they were busy trying to negotiate with the Managers Association. There wasn't even agreement between the two unions as to whether at executive planner level and at a senior executive planner level, there would even be a requirement for a planning qualification. So the end result was my generation coming out in 1979-80, and for a number of years afterwards, the only jobs available, unlike Kieran, he managed to get in before that, the only jobs available were temporary. So I ended up for 6 years in Waterford City Council on temporary 6-month contracts, as did everybody who came out around that time. And then, of course, unfortunately, about 83, there was another of our many recessions, and a lot of people had to emigrate. And I know quite a number of very good planners who went abroad and then came back in the 90s. But literally, many of us were on temporary contracts, not knowing from 1 6 months to the next whether you get another job. Now, I was lucky enough then to get the Chief Planning Officer job in Kildare County Council, which at that stage was senior exec, and moved to Kildare. But in essence, for the best part of 6 years, there were no permanent jobs for planners in Ireland. And it was literally a case of, will I be continued on? So needless to say, you kept the manager very happy with the work you did, because there was a big threat that if you didn't, since you weren't permanent, they might put in somebody else. Now, the one thing I had, which was a legacy of Michael Goff, a former president of the Institute, he had been the chief planner in Waterford before me. So, as Enda said, in theory, you were supposed to report to the county or city engineer. In fact, because of Michael's work, I had a direct reporting relationship with the city manager, much to the annoyance of successive city engineers. But it meant that I could get things done in Waterford that your standard planner who had to go through a county engineer who had thought planning was only about regulation and nothing else. We were able to get things done that other places couldn't do, including getting archaeological investigations done and so on, which ended up as, if anyone knows Waterford now, it's developed even more. So we got things done because of, in effect, personal relationships with the county manager. Now, you also needed a very go-ahead county manager. I was lucky in Waterford City. There was Michael Doody was the manager, and he believed in planning. I know from colleagues in other local authorities, particularly in some of the more rural areas, particularly towards the western seaboard, managers didn't believe in planning. So much so that you ended up with a situation where the planners were often trying to persuade the manager that planning was actually a separate discipline. It wasn't a subset of engineering. And it took probably, I think, 20 years for that to get through, from the 70s onwards, that there was such a thing as planning, and it wasn't part of engineering. And I think there were still one or two holdouts of counties where the chief planner was never to be a planner, but it was actually an engineer, senior engineer, eventually came. And I think right up to the early 2000s, there were still a couple of counties where that still became the norm. So it meant that if you came into that local authority as a planner, you'd get as far as executive planner. But after that, the post wasn't open to you because your promotion was not open to you because you hadn't got planning qualification. Now, in fairness to the IPI, very strongly from the start, this was one of the things the IPI were strongly in favour of, that we had a proper planning system, professional planners running that system. That, I'm sure, didn't go down well with the bureaucrats in the Custom House. Also, and I think it's evident from some of the stuff we have now in terms of the legislation, the IPI was very much seen as a radical voice. So when the Kenny report came out in the 70s, the IPI was very strongly of the view that this is another part of planning that's necessary. Now, in preparation for this seminar, I actually went through the Oireachtas debates. And actually on that very day, the 31st of July, 1963, in the Shannon, I think it was the Fine Gael opposition spokesman, who was, you might have heard his name afterwards, Professor Jim Doog. His comment, or one of his comments when it came out, was that there's an issue here in relation to financing of local authorities. And he said, we need a system akin to the rating of site value. Site value tax comes to mind. We need an alternative to the recovery of betterment from developers, because once a local authority has by its action improved capability of land, that should go back to the local authority. And here we are in 2023, still arguing about whether or not we should have effectively betterment with the new piece of legislation in front of the Oireachtas at the moment. So it's taking an awful long time from people like Jim Doog, literally 60 years ago, talking about that in the Shannon, to getting it to happen slowly, very, very slowly in Ireland. But the other comment that I think is relevant to what we were talking about is Neil Delaney, when he actually introduced it in the Shannon. And he said, this is about what he wanted the bill to do. And he said, I might mention at this point, the bill seeks to ensure that local authorities will exercise their planning powers in full, and they will not restrict themselves to the operation of controls as they have done in the past, but they'll make a real effort at positive planning. And he talked about local authorities as development corporations using the CPO powers which he had granted them to assemble sites for development. And Jim Doog also commented that he saw nothing wrong with the local authority using those powers and making a profit. Now, I'd ask you and everybody here, how many county managers or chief executives do you know who still don't see their role as other than providers of physical infrastructure and don't see their role as intervening in the property market to actually get development going? They leave it entirely to the private sector. So there are lessons even from the debates in 63,
60 years ago.
what we do now, you know?
Thanks, Philip. I'm going to come back to some of those too. I suppose finally, Paula, so UCD celebrated its 50 years of planning education in 2016, 17. It was really, what was the shape of planning education back when the Act was coming through in the early years of the school in UCD, and maybe any similarities or differences between what you're doing today compared to how it was starting off, which I think every speaker has talked about, the different, diplomas and the different ways it was being run.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thanks to the other speakers. It's fascinating to hear people's experience of their education in planning. And I suppose in the 1960s, when the 1963 Planning Act was being brought into existence, planning education was embryonic across the world. It wasn't just in an Irish context. And planning education was trying to establish itself as a discipline on its own right across both UK, US, and other places. It wasn't unusual that planning had to carve a place in universities here in Ireland. And just as we've heard that planning had to distinguish itself in the local authority, that role of distinguishing itself from architecture and engineering in the university was also a battle royale, as you might say, right through the 1960s, the 1970s, and into the 1980s. A key influence on planning education and also the Act, I suppose, was the Abrams report. Charles Abrams, the UN, sent on a UN mission to Ireland, again, to give advice about the shape of the Act, but also about how and the role of planning education, I suppose, in implementing an Act. And his report, which was entitled, funny enough, Urban Renewal Project in Ireland, was influential in terms of the Act and the establishment of planning education. And that report pointed out that a well-planned course in city planning and housing was desirable. And at that time, his recommendations were that the universities should add planning courses to their architectural groups. So again, it was still seen very much as part of existing disciplines in the universities. But he also spoke about offering educational courses to people in collateral fields, is what he called it, who wished to relate their particular skills to city planning. So the recommendations of the report were very clearly to set up planning education. That was addressed very early on in 1962. The Bolton Street had put in place a part-time course that was 3 years diploma, and that was the first sort of formal planning education. But then in 1966, on the 11th of October, UCD started a diploma in planning, and that was that 3-year part-time diploma. And that was initially run again from the architecture school or department as it was then. And initially it was only that people from engineering and architecture could come onto that diploma, but that was only for a year. And then subsequently the university broadened it out and allowed people coming in from cognate disciplines onto that diploma. In 1973-74 academic year, the Department of Town Planning was formally established, and that was retitled then the Department of Regional and Urban Planning in 1980, around the same time as the MOUP, the 2-year Master in Regional Urban Planning, was also introduced. And that story of the name of the degree is definitely one that's in the lore and was definitely something Michael talked about. I suppose just looking back, the initial diploma programme and the initial MRUP were as broad ranging as the programmes we have today. So looking back at the courses that were on that initial diploma course, it was history of planning, planning theory, survey analysis and planning practice, economics of land use, urban design and renewal, landscape design and amenity, law and administration, traffic planning and the design of roads and services, elements of applied geology and economic geography, elements of sociology, elements of economic planning, practical work of field and studio and a thesis. So as broad ranging as we would have today, which is really, I think, gives the level of foresight that was there in developing those programs. And it was people like Kevin I. Nolan who were instrumental in battling for planning in the university and those early years. And I suppose one of the differences between then and now was a lot of that teaching was being taught as service teaching from other departments in, for example, UCD. And of course, having practitioners come in and talk, lecture, provide studio support and so on. And that's something that is a tradition, a long-standing tradition that remains today across all of the planning schools, that practitioner insight and support is hugely important, and all of the schools continue that. At the time, throughout the 1970s, there was 4 staff in UCD, for example. There was Kevin I. Nolan, Jim Eustace, Dr. Michael Bannon, and Dr. Brendan Murphy that I think Kieran mentioned. So a really small cohort of staff. In the 1980s, again, 4 staff members, Professor Jim Feely, Dr. Michael Bannon, Jim Eustace, and John Mead. The one thing I'd mention, all men. So it was a very male-dominated discipline at the time. But that has changed, and we can see that even in the numbers today in staffing the academic planning departments and throughout the profession, we've a much greater gender balance. I suppose maybe one difference perhaps at the time was that some of the offer in the planning schools was, and particularly in UCD, was to provide for planners in an Irish system, largely going to work in local authorities. And that was what it had to be, because that was where the employment was. I think when we see the shift perhaps in the 1990s, as I think Kieran, you clearly pointed out, and Enda did as well. I mean, the breadth of planning changed. I mean, we went from a couple of one piece of legislation to multiple. The whole environmental legislation was growing. There was also EU funding, and the types of opportunities that brought for undertaking projects of renewal in Irish towns and cities, of investing in integrated projects, and so on, that required rethinking programs and rethinking the planning program in UCD, definitely. There was also in the 1990s a significant change in terms of staffing in the UCD program. That was, I suppose, planning coming maybe into its teenage years. It was still a bit messy. There was still lots of battles to be won, but there was, I think, that a process of maturation and definitely new confidence. Planning was clearly established in the local authorities at that stage, but it was also starting to be established as a recognised discipline in the university. There was always a risk that it could be subsumed, I think, back into engineering and architecture. And the growth of a research culture helped in establishing and firmly giving a place to planning in academia. And that was really important in the late 1990s. And Dr. Jim O'Brada was the first planner to qualify with a planning PhD. And that was really important turning point, I think, as well, in underpinning that. There always had been planning research going on, and the academics in UCD were undertaking research. And of course, Ferris Ferbaha was undertaking research in planning, which was really important as well. In the 1990s, I suppose the staff became more diverse in terms of gender and even nationality, if I suppose we can call Henk van der Kamp, he's more Irish now than Dutch, but at the time, that was the first time we had somebody from an more international perspective, perhaps lecturing. And of course, with Bernard Grist coming on board, the planning staff was started when I was then came on board in 1997, a more gender balance in our staff. The 2000s saw significant growth and change, and particularly in 2000, on foot of a €2 million investment in the planning, building and facilities, we were able to increase our intake on the MOUP programme, and that was really on foot of Michael Bannon's efforts to really try and increase the numbers of students doing planning. I suppose the difference now in planning. We have in UCD, if we just to look at it in terms of staffing, we have 14 full-time staff members. We have one shared post between planning and biosystems engineering. That's in the planning staff. We have a whole range of planning programs. So it's not just a single master's program. We have an undergraduate program. We have a master's in urban design and planning. And you know, the planning education has expanded to other universities as well. So we have the M-Plan in Cork and the bachelor's degree in TU Dublin. So I think, you know, planning has changed, but it has each of those particular schools and each of the different planning degrees have different flavors. I think that's important. And I think that's the way planning education will go. I think the fact that planning is underpinned and planning education is underpinned by the level of research is really important too.
Thanks again for that. Paula, and we've about 10 minutes left for questions. So if you do have questions for the panel, do ask them via the Q&A function. Yes, I mean, I suppose the first one that's come in is from Tanya White, and going back to quoting Dáil debates like Philip did, there was Lionel Booth, TD, and he was talking about the bill, meaning that planning was moving from something that was suspicious and something for cranks and idealists to something that was being accepted and was widespread, I suppose, buy-in or starting to be buy-in. And Tanya's asking, I suppose 60 years on, do you think there still is that suspicion of planning and planners and what they're trying to do? And if there is, what we can do about it? And also, I guess part of that is the perception of planning and the perception of planners and how that has changed since the 63 Act in the last 60 years. So, I mean, I don't know, Enda, how do you think planners were regarded in the 1960s, and do you think that's improved since?
Well, I think it has changed a fair bit, because I'm quite disappointed in recent times to see that I find that most planners are rather too negative. As a planner, your job is to promote and facilitate development, not to hinder it, not to knock. And when I went into private practice, I was amazed at the way I found myself treated by fellow planners, so negative. But when I was county planning officer, I would see any potential planner or developer within a week and tell them in a few minutes what we wanted and all that. Nowadays, you cannot get to see anybody. And I think the Institute itself and the planners have to buck up and become more positive in what they're doing. Now, of course, we have to insist on proper planning and all that, but we should be more positive. And I think in my earlier days, planners were much more positive, although they were very suspicious. Because, you know, if you take someone in rural Ireland in 63 Act, somebody suddenly could be told by the local authority, you can't do that. You know, the idea of getting a negative thing from the county council was unbelievable. And the poor planning assistants, you know, got awful abuse because of that. How dare they tell you cannot build a house here? You know? Yeah. But that is involved in, and what I think as planners, we must look at ourselves and say that we could change a bit, we could improve things, and we should be.
And yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I think there's another aspect of this that I think an awful lot of people don't understand. And that's why I think we can be looked at with suspicion. A lot of people say, oh, the planners tell you can't do this, you can't do that. And I agree, we have to be facilitators. You know, we should be looking for solutions rather than simply denying the problems. But one of the things that an awful lot of people in the public, and I tell people this, they're amazed, and that is that planners are not generally the decision maker. The planner is an advisor to the manager or the director of services, and they're the people who are making the decision. The planner is an advisor to the county councillors for making the development plan, and they're the ones who make the decisions. Now, they quite often turn their own decisions on their heads when it doesn't suit them, but our function is generally as advisors. There's very few planners, even at senior level, that have delegated functions. to actually make decisions. And you know, that actually isn't a weakness. That actually is a strength. That is, we can say, look, we're only giving you how we see things are shaping up. We can give you the facts, we can give you the figures, we can give you the strategies, we can give you the policies. But it's up to you to decide whether they're right or wrong. And hopefully, and 90% of the time, you know, if you look at the number of planning decisions that are made where the manager goes against the recommendation of the planner, they are so few and far between. And you know, I'll give you a good example of that. When I arrived down in Leitrim, in 2000 and 2002, end of 2002, there was a big hoo-ha in the council chamber about the number of decisions of the planning authorities that were being overturned by on board panel. And I was asked, is this not scurrilous that, you know, we're having something like 50% of all the applications that go to the board on appeal the decision of the local authority has been overturned. And I said, well, there must be something behind that. And I went in and I looked at every one of the histories that we're talking about. And the 50% of the overturn was where the Director of Services had gone against the recommendation of the planning department. You know, and when I explained, look, the manager, the Director of Services were advised that this is what is proper planning. And they had recommended a refusal, and you went ahead and you granted planning permission, and in many cases with very inept mediatory conditions. Is it any wonder that the board overturned the decision? So, you know, but that, as I get back to my original point, people need to know that when planners are telling you, like he said, when a developer comes in and you're saying, this is what we're looking for. What we're doing is we're giving the best advice that we can. That should this come in this form, it's unlikely to get a positive response. The other thing that we don't promote is behind it all, we're not developers because we're advisors and we're not decision makers. We have no skin in the game. So our views are generally very impartial. You know, we're not working for the developer, we're not working for anybody in particular, and we're not having to make that decision. So when we say we think this is what's good and this is what's not good, we have no skin in the game. And therefore, you know, I find it sometimes amazing how sometimes councillors say, oh, we need some independent advice on this. Actually, the planner is the independent advice. As is demonstrated by the number of times that maybe a Director of Service or a manager overrides our recommendation.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, so
There's an issue about public confidence in the planning system. I mean, if we look through from 63 onwards, in 76, they took the minister out of making decisions and gave it to the board. By the 2000 Act, they changed Section 4 of the 55 Management Act to get rid of Section 4s in effect by making them requiring a three-quarters majority. Then with the Mahon and the flood tribunals, the wings of the councillors in overzoning were clipped. And 2010 Act, we had strategy and so on. But one of the key things, and I was president at the time when of the IPI when the flood tribunal came out. Despite all of the evidence over 5 years in front of that tribunal, not a single professional planner was earmarked as having done anything wrong in all of the things that happened during that time. Lots of councillors were, and one former county manager was, but not a single planner. I think most planners, the great majority of planners, have professional integrity. And I think part of the problem is that people may think the planning system is planners, whereas in fact, most planners are great and wouldn't do that kind of thing. Now, recent things in the board have dented the confidence in the board. But the reality is, for most of the 60 years, nobody ever argued that planners were on the take. They argued others were, but not the planners.
Paula, just on that, like, I mean, from even a student point of view, what sort of attitudes do students coming in now have towards planning or the planning system? Are they proud to be studying planning? Has there been a shift there? Do they?
I think they are really proud to be studying planning. Certainly the students enjoy their the subjects they're doing, I think sometimes they feel that there's a negative perception of planning and that they struggle sometimes to defend it, when they're with their families and friends and so on. I think sometimes the undergraduates at the start of the 4-year program don't really know what exactly planning is and how they're going to fit in. But I think they all still have that sense of the wider profession and what that means to be a planner. And I think they feel still that they can really make a difference, which I think is really important. So that idealism, that vision is still there when we talk to our younger planners and to the students who come through, and they're wonderful and think in different ways. I think what they think though is there's different ways of doing planning, and if their careers they will spend time in different places. They'll spend time abroad. They'll may spend time doing different types of planning. So I think they recognise that quite a bit now. But I think they're still proud to be planners. I think they're proud of the Irish being planners in the Irish planning system. They recognise that Irish planning has a particular type of a cultural framework within it. Even our international students find that and are interested in that. And I think what's useful as well is that we're producing planners who now can work beyond Ireland. And I think what's useful is our research that we do in Ireland is now taken as, offering solutions elsewhere around the globe. So I think that's really good. We are now, rather than back in 1963, we were looking abroad for people to come in and tell us how to do things. Now we're given advice right across the globe in relation to planning, in relation to policy making. I think that's really something we can be proud of.
We're at time. Unless any of you have some burning point that you want to make, we might draw to a close.
That's all the questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've covered most of the things that came in there. So look, really just wanted to say thanks to Enda and Kieran and Philip and Paula, and thanks to everyone for joining us. This is the first webinar of topics like this, but we hope to do more of these as we ramp up to 2025, which is the 50th anniversary of the Institute. And that is something that we're going to be marking and celebrating. And we have a full CPD program for the rest of the year as well. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon.